In a small village nestled between mountains and surrounded by a dense forest, there was an old warning passed down through generations: never enter the woods after sunset. No one knew exactly when this belief began, but the elders insisted that something ancient and dangerous lived among the trees. The more superstitious villagers claimed it was a wandering spirit. Others, more practical, believed the woods were simply an easy place to get lost and never be found. Ángel, a young man from the city who had just inherited a cabin in the village after his distant uncle's death, didn't believe in ghosts or rural superstitions. To him, it was simple. The forest was just a bunch of trees, and the legends were nothing but stories designed to scare outsiders. The cabin, located at the edge of the woods, was small but cozy. From his window, Ángel could see the line of trees that marked the beginning of the thick forest. At first, he enjoyed the peace and quiet of the place, far from the noise of the city. But it didn't take long for him to notice something odd. Every night, right after the sunset behind the mountains, a long, melodic whistle echoed through the air. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but soon he realized that the sound had a pattern. It was as if someone was whistling an old, melancholy tune. From the woods, intrigued, he asked the locals about it, but they all avoided the topic. Only one old woman, her face wrinkled with age and her eyes piercing, dared to answer. "That whistle isn't human. If you hear it, ignore it. And please, don't go into the woods." Ángel laughed it off. How could a simple melody be dangerous? That night as he worked in the cabin, the whistle sounded again. It was clearer now, almost as if the source of the sound was closer. Tired of the warnings and convinced that someone was playing a prank on him, he decided to respond. He opened the window and whistled back, mimicking the melody. The forest answered almost immediately, but this time the sound was more intense, as though it was coming from the edge of the trees. Without thinking much about it, he grabbed a lantern and ventured out of the cabin, determined to find the prankster. As he walked deeper into the woods, the whistle guided him, always a few steps ahead. The branches cracked beneath his boots, and the lantern barely lit the path. All around him the air felt heavy, and the usual sounds of the forest were eerily absent. No insects, no birds, only the persistent whistle. Finally, he reached a clearing. The whistle stopped abruptly, and the silence enveloped him like a suffocating blanket. He felt as though something was watching him. He moved the lantern in all directions but saw nothing, until suddenly a shadow slipped between the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. A tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. It was taller than normal, with unnaturally long limbs, and where its eyes and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, dark surface. It had no face, but Ángel could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The whistle returned, but now it didn't come from the figure. It came from everywhere in the woods, as if the trees themselves were singing. The figure began moving toward him, its steps slow and unnatural, like it was floating. In a final burst of panic, Ángel closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. When he opened them again, he was standing in front of his cabin, the lantern still lit in his hand. There was no trace of what he had seen, but the whistle was still faintly echoing in the distance. That night, Ángel packed his belongings and left the village for good. The locals, noticing his sudden departure, weren't surprised. They said Ángel wouldn't be the first or the last to hear the whistle and return changed. Since then, the whistle has been heard more often, and those who respond to it, the villagers say, never return.